4 colleges on a 6-year plan. Because my family said, banking and computers. I said, history. Good luck, you'll pay your own tuition. Anyway, I don't know how kind that sounds, but we are very pleased that you could come and be with us here. He will tell you all about forced migrations in Poland after 1944, and I'm looking forward to it very much. I'll share an anecdote when you are done. Professor Isanski is a sociologist, so David Satter mostly referred to him in this room. He is with the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Poznan. He specializes in issues related to migrations and their social consequences. Most of his work is field work, which is extremely valuable. Scholars nowadays, unfortunately, prefer theory. Then they don't have to move their lazy butts into an archive and research. Not Professor Isanski, I'm pleased to say, and here he is for you, all the way from Poland.
Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to have an opportunity to present my paper. The paper is connected with research project financed by the National Science Council of Poland. The project title is The New Society in the Regained Polish Territories. Here I am. And this is my introductory slide. So.
I think I'm sorry, the PowerPoint. I don't really know how. I think that if you just use the arrows to go.
So I come from Poznan. My scientific interest concerns migratory studies, mobility in general, and some social capital issues. The agenda for my today's speech is forced migrations during the Second World War and the new borders of Poland after the 1945, and some additional comments. So,
There must be not going to Siberia. It's the world grass.
just before the war. Icons. Okay, let's go to the map. So we start with the 1939 and the deportation of Poles. The deportation 1 million of Poles to the Soviet Union. The deportation of Poles from the western Poland to the so-called central government. So that is the central part of Poland that Germans founded to squeeze Poles in there. And there was also a kind of a migration of 500,000 of Germans from the Soviet Union to western Poland that was captured by Germany, and all these migrations happened before 1941. So there was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin after invading Poland of the migration of ethnic Germans from Soviet Union to Poland. As a result of all these migratory flows, the situation in Poland became really hard for civilians, and Poland as an occupied country was, how to say that, it was the darkest part of our history. Again, as Professor Wadakiewicz wrote in his intermarium book, famous philosopher's thought of Thomas Hobbes, Homo homini lupus est, man is a wolf man. So it was a time of fighting everybody against everybody, at first fighting for the survival and then fighting for is an example of the times, the Ulma family. And honestly speaking, I hope you know the case. This is a case of just a regular family in southern Poland. And during the war they gave shelter to 8 Jews, and unfortunately in 1944 they were denounced and all the family members, including children, were shot, as well as Jews. And just a couple of years ago they were awarded with the Right to Choose Among the Nations title. There is also a beatification process initiated by the Roman Catholic Church, and just a couple of years ago there's also a museum opened in their village, so you can easily visit the web page or visit the museum, which is highly recommended. During the German and Soviet occupation, Poles started the underground state. There was a European phenomena, the state existing in an informal way, on one hand with the constant ties with the Polish government in exile in London. We constituted a home army, underground army of course, underground education system, underground all kinds of social life, including schools, papers, courts, and this is a poster from the Professor Jankarski book, the first one to inform the West about the real face of German occupation in Poland, especially the Jewish situation in Poland. This is the slide to present the casualties in Poland, and I present these figures because I want to focus on forced migrations, and this is about the wartime. And civilians in Poland were the main victims of the war in Poland. The first graph presents the number of deaths in Poland, up to 6 million of human beings. The second graph presents the proportion of the soldiers to civilians. As you can see, the vast majority of victims were civilians, and the very last one presents the proportion between Jews and other Polish citizens who died during the war. It is just to talk about millions, but there's another American author, Timothy Snyder, wrote in his book, it is not about a million of victims, it's about one single human being that should be multiplied million times. So it is a very difficult sliding part. And I would also like to present the proportion of victims, casualties in other neighboring countries during the World War II, the casualties of soldiers involved in all the military operations and civilians. For the Soviet Union, it was about 26 million of deaths, with more than 10 million of soldiers who died during the war, and about 60 million of civilians. For Germany, more than 5 million of soldiers died and more than 2 million of civilians. As well in the United States, as you can see. And here there's a comparison of the World War II casualties for the United States, Germany, Soviet Union and Poland. As you can see, Poland was that 1 in 7 of every single citizen from Poland died during the war. This map presents the scale of migration after the war and the directions of human movement. Red man symbolizes ethnic Poles. The blue ones are Germans. Just after the war, officially, the date of removal of Germans from Poland was the 1st of August in 1944, the date of Warsaw Uprising and Polish government in exile. Issued a statement to remove all the Germans from Polish land, and the western territories of Poland, which is here, western and northern, was left by about 9 million of Germans. There were also some Ukrainians, you can see the yellow figures, were resettled from southern Poland, about 100,000 of them to the western Poland, and 500,000 of them resettled to Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The green figure represents Belarusians. They were resettled from Poland to Belarusian Soviet Republic. And there were also many other directions of migrations to Poland after the end of the war. Former prisoners, forced workers from the West, 1.5 million people. Returns of other former soldiers and immigrants from Southern and Western Europe. There was also a resettlement of Poles from the eastern parts of pre-war Poland. As you probably know, we have lost, in 1939, we have lost 51% of our territory. And after the war, it was captured by Soviet Union. So more than 1.5 million of Poles were proposed to migrate to the Poland within new borders. So they agreed, and this map shows the directions and migration in numbers. And this is the present day borderline of Poland. Right in here with the pink color, we have the shape of Poland before the Second World War. By the end of 47th, 7.6 million Germans had left Poland, and Ukrainians, as I have already said. There was also an organized action, Vistula, to resettle Ukrainians from the southeastern part of Poland, and one of the reasons of that action was connected with the so-called Woły massacre, so the situation in southeastern Poland with the ethnic cleansing of Polish minority in Ukrainian land. Ukrainian, I mean, a part of German Empire during the war with the Ukrainian governance. And what happened in 1945? So Poland with the new borders. So it started with deportations and migrations, as I have said. It was a time of violence and terror. The terror which can be symbolized by looting. I've noticed that in America you say, you loot, I shoot, during any kind of a social tensions or a catastrophe or anything, but in Poland it could be said, we loot, we shoot, because the looter were soldiers, Soviet soldiers, Polish soldiers, and it was another nightmare of post-war times for civilians. Even the war was over, the civilians still had to face the problem of Soviet troops, of murders, of demobilized soldiers, and it was a situation that can be also defined by the term crimes of court, when during the communist regime and there was a terror, and even though an estimated number of soldiers of Polish underground state was up to 100,000 soldiers after the 1945, who refused to surrender and cooperate with communists. Many of them were captured and murdered. This is the map. Presents borders of Poland across times, and I put it in my presentation to answer the question why the new territories after the war were named regained territories. So this is the border. The darkest line represents the borders of Poland 1,000 years ago. So Poland as a country was constituted 1,050 years ago, and the first historical borders of Poland looks more or less like this, even though in the later centuries we were more open to the eastern direction, especially after the union with Lithuanians and Ukrainians. After the Second World War, the official propaganda claimed that it was just the regained land because we, I mean Poles, 1,000 years ago were there. How was the daily life in 1945? Up to 80% of arable land was left uncultivated. These are estimations of Professor Zakrzewski from his Black Book of Communism. Nearly all houses, office buildings and production plants and manufacturers were deserted, destroyed. So the majority of infrastructure was destroyed, including roads, railroads and so on. There was also help of the United Nations Relief and Reconciliation Action, and in 1945 there was also a threat of starvation for civilians, so it was a very important part of help. And there was also an important term, the sense of temporariness, because at least up to 1947, according to the public opinion, the borders were unnecessary, so people who were forced to migrate to the West were really afraid that sooner or later they will find themselves in Germany again, so they were afraid of this situation. And I want to present you some of the findings from the Institute of Western Affairs from Poznan. They collected up to 1,000 of memories of settlers during the 3 editions of the competition. The first one was in 1956, and the second one was in 1960, and the last one in 1970s. And the competition was announced in a very unique moment of the history of Poland, because the 1956 was the date of the as many people thought in Poland, the collapse of communism, because after Stalin's death and the 20th, you know what I mean, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union announced some problems with communism, and there was such an euphoria with the situation in Poland that many Poles were dreaming about the freedom at that times.
Third World War.
Exactly, and it was probably a coincidence, but as a result, I mean the Institute of Western Affairs, has many interesting memories of people who, for the first time in their life, were able to describe not only the war, but after the post-war migrations and all the cruelty and violence, including state violence, all the looting, rapes and so on, conducted by Soviet soldiers, by Polish People's Army, and so on and so forth. So this is why we see this group of memories so much important. There is also another argument why these memories are so important. This is a picture from a German city in Bavaria, Berchtesgaden. The city, close to this city there was a Hitler's residence, and so it used to be a kind of really yes.
I'm just kidding.
Okay. So
You can see that.
yes. By the way, the residence was looted by Germans in 1945, so it's just another part of the story. But there is also a kind of question how to define the history. Anytime we talk about forced migrations in Poland, there is our point, I mean Polish point of view, and there is also German perspective that contains a number of 7 to 9 million of people resettled, forced to leave their land, I mean the western part of Poland. So that's it. And here, just as a sociologist, I'd like to present some of facts and figures about these parts of Poland, even though this one country, there are still some differences visible. One of the very important indicators we use in sociology to say that society is more or less integrated might be the divorce rate. And I'm not sure how we treat it in America, but in Poland it is a kind of an indicator of social change. By the way, in considering the Russian example, the first speaker was talking about Russia and the very sad situation about Russian society. The divorce rate for Siberian part of Russia is much higher. For Siberian part of Russia, for every 1,000 of marriages, there is 1,600 divorces, which it is much worse you can even imagine.
For every 1,000 marriages, 1,600
divorces. But in Poland it's not so bad for now. However, if we consider the western part of Poland with people living there since 1945, as you can see, it is a bit higher. In the western districts, almost half of the population claims that they have Eastern roots, which means that they somehow feel linked with the eastern part of Poland, with the pre-war Poland. And going to conclusion, I wanted to say again about the forced migrations. It was an important part of the modern history of Poland. It was one of the biggest in Polish history, period of the biggest human movement from the east to the west, from the west to the east. And about 1/4 of Polish populations was somehow forced to change the place of residence, and we can still observe some results of this process. I didn't want to go deeper into sociological details here. There is also a kind of social mobility issues, because the society in Western Poland is much more active as migrants. As you probably know, Poland has a big problem with the out-migration. In the past 15 years, we have lost at least 3 million of young people who decided to go to the West, to United Kingdom, to Germany, to Norway. And the proportion of migrants from the western part of Poland is above the average. And finally, a picture from the eastern borders, eastern part of Poland, the pre-war territories of Poland, in Ukraine. Well, I apologize for my broken English and all the technical problems. I hope you understood my general thoughts. However, if you have any questions, I can answer that.
Great. Thank you very much. There's so much human misery in this presentation. We're not going to cheer up with the next presentation, but I'd like Professor I to field a couple of questions. Remember about statistics in times of strife. They're very inaccurate. Hence the Dean of Holocaust Studies, Raoul Hilberg, said, here's the low ballpark figure, 5.3 million. Here's the high one, 6.4, 6.5. Simply approximating is already a challenge. How many died? How to tell apart who died? For example, if you were Jewish in Vilnius, you could be counted as a Lithuanian war dead, as a Soviet war dead, as a Polish war dead, or as a Jewish war dead. Why? Well, because there's this competition to pump up figures. The Soviet figure of 25 million Soviet dead only holds water if you count the Estonian Waffen-SS, which died fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. Those soldiers. In Latvia, Lithuania, the SS Wachmannschaften of the Belarusians, and the Ukrainian SS. Then sure, that will be enough Soviet war dead for you. Also, you have to understand that the Soviets, Stalin, fought so ruthlessly that the Red Army lost more people at Bucharest and Budapest in 1944-45 than at Stalingrad, because the Soviets just didn't care how many of their own people died. Keep that in mind too. This is a myth, also sometimes sold as 25 million Russian dead. That's all, almost half the war dead were from Central Asia, from Ukraine, from the Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine. More Ukrainians died fighting in the Red Army against the Germans than died fighting for free or nationalist Ukraine for the Germans. So how do you square this circle? The Soviets were very generous. They assumed everybody. And they included everybody in their statistics. So I really feel sorry for us historians and for sociologists how to figure out what the real casualties were. Until quite recently at Babi Yar, outside of Kiev, it was just Soviet citizens. Then after 1991 or so, the Jewish community got organized and it remembered its own dead, which is what should have happened. However, it took the Ukrainians about 20 years to remember that there were some Ukrainian nationalists too. And God forbid you bump into graves which had been dug out before them in 1937, 1938 and 1939. But I'm not going to steal Dr. Sommer's thunder. Instead, after my brief remarks, I'd like you to ask 2 questions of Dr. Go ahead. Mrs. Forrest.
I'm wondering if you could address the issue of the number of Poles that died in the concentration camps, the German concentration camps during the war, and the reasons, the various reasons that they were sent there.
Well, the reason was very simple. They were Poles when they were sent to German concentration camps. The numbers, even if it is so many years after the war, we are still counting. I mean, the Institute of the National Memory is still conducting many investigations, and the numbers, well, it's just. It is easy to say 1 to 3 million. As estimated, 3 million of ethnic Poles died during the war, and similar number of Jews, I mean citizens of Poland, also died during the war. I'm not able to say how many of them died in concentration camps because I don't have figures about it. I think that we can
Auschwitz, 70,000 of Auschwitz was set up there. Just one example again. Oh, don't go. Auschwitz was set up as a camp for Christian political prisoners in June 1940. So it is now the Soviets, or Soviet propaganda after the war, claimed that 6 million people died in Auschwitz. It is now clear that not 6 million, but 1.3 Jews from all over Europe. I think there was a sizable contingent from Poland, but they were mostly from Hungary, France, the Netherlands, etc., etc., and Austria and Germany. As far as Polish Christians, many of the political prisoners, but also criminals, if you participate in the black market, smuggled a bit of meat into a city and you were arrested, you went to Auschwitz. So 70,000 of them died. 70. And then there were also Soviet POWs. For instance, President Yushchenko's father, did you know that? Was captured and sent to Auschwitz. The president of Ukraine, the Orange Revolution guy, he was sent to Auschwitz. The Soviet POWs were also the first ones to be gassed in Auschwitz because the Germans wanted to test the new facilities, which were established, I don't know if you realize that, for humanitarian reasons. Why for humanitarian reasons? Because the Germans had been shooting, the SS had been shooting human beings, mostly Jews, for over half a year. And their bodies couldn't hack what their sick brains had contrived. So the SS men started puking, crying, breaking down. Himmler himself fainted and cried when he saw a mass execution of Jews. So Himmler said, for humanitarian reasons, we can no longer expose our proud SS men to such horrible things because the delicate German soul, we have to do it, but we can't. We can't use shooting anymore. So they experimented with a Soviet invention, which was put in place in 1938 in Moscow, when there were not enough ways to shoot people in Moscow. The NKVD invented a gas van, where exhaust pipes were redirected inside the van, and they drove around Moscow and killed people. It was not very efficient. It was not very efficient for the Germans. So after trying this Soviet invention, at Helmo nad Narem, first gassing of Jews was in December 1941. After trying this invention, and finding it inefficient, the SS and police turned to IG Farben, I think was the name of the company. That company built a facility in Birkenau, which was about a kilometer away from Auschwitz, to gas people, because then nobody saw anything except a Sonderkommando, which was consisted of prisoners who ushered other prisoners in. So the Sonderkommando was mostly Jewish. And at the end, the Germans would shoot them. Yes. Horrible. Sorry.
Just on what
And we don't know.
You talk about the criminals. The criminals were also involved in Polish underground state, as they offered
Free market.
a kind of service to the government in exile, that they would pickpocket Germans with their documents and guns. So they were also involved in the underground state.
They were.
Or Polish criminals, I mean. That's the fact. And the second question.
Yes, I mean, of course, it's maybe not the topic of your speech. However,
Question. Not a speech.
Yes. However, was any immigration from Kazakhstan at that time or nothing? That was my question.
You mean the present day migration
Present
from
is not
Kazakhstan?
at that time, because or nothing at that time. Or do you have no information about that?
So as far as I'm concerned, the majority of people who were managed to escape from Soviet Kazakhstan joined the General Anderson.
I mean the one which has been resettled in 1937, 36-37, this one. I'm talking about this.
Well, depends what you mean by Poles from Kazakhstan, because the people who live today in Kazakhstan, who has Polish roots since 19th century, as during the so-called November uprising, some of the soldiers were sentenced to Siberia. They had to live in Kazakhstan, and there are some people with Polish roots in there. However, as far as I'm concerned, there were no organized action of resettling of Poles after the 1945 from Kazakhstan. The vast majority of Poles, 1.5 million of them who came to Poland, were from the former eastern border lands of pre-war Poland, say Belarus, Ukraine and Lithuania as well.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.